Today, in our ComAI lectures, with a talk presented by Jeremy Knox, who is professor in digital education at Oxford University. Beside that, he is responsible or co-responsible for the Society for Research in Higher Education. It's a digital university network, if I understood it well. Jeremy's research interest is in the relationship between education, data-driven technologies, and the wider society, including artificial intelligence. He has had many research projects, beside others, funded by the ESRC and the British Council in the UK. And I hope you know at least two books published by him. One is AI and Education in China at Routledge, published last year. And the other one is Posthumanism and the Massive Open Online Course, also published at Routledge 2016. Beside that, Jeremy has published a high number of journal articles on education, technologies, and AI. The title of his talk today is AI, Education and Power. So a warm welcome to you, and we are all looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction. Hope everyone can hear me okay. So it's always a great pleasure to speak about my work. I really appreciate the team here around ComAI for inviting me. And I'm especially appreciative for you all as well for allowing me to speculate a little bit about this topic of AI, education and power. What I'm going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so is some work in progress. And I probably have more questions than I do answers about these issues. So hopefully you'll forgive me in my speculation. And I don't think in this talk there's going to be anything particularly original in my discussion of power, but hopefully re-emphasizing some questions and issues around power will be useful, I suggest, in thinking about the questions that are emerging around new forms of AI, particularly communicative AI, large language models, and generative AI. Essentially, power, I want to argue, is still relevant for those of you who think this is a well-worn territory in the discussion of education and technology. So let me begin with a couple of terms that I think have become the watchwords of education, the promotion of education and technology. Personalization and scale. And these two ideas are linked and they work together, I want to suggest, to promote an idea of the individual and the universal. Attention to you as a student as the foundation of education through personalization. And of course, what I mean there is education that is tailored to meet the individual needs of students. But also attention to everybody. Attention to the universal, to expanding education through economies of scale. And I hope those two ideas sound familiar to you if you're interested and aware of education technology. And of course, the point I want to stress tonight is that technologies like AI are the latest in a progression of technologies that are being suggested to provide education with these benefits. And really, in the first part of the talk, what I want to do is suggest that it's not just AI that's affording these benefits of personalization and scale. There is a whole interesting history of education technologies that have promised to do just those things. So that's the first part, the introduction. And then what I want to do is make a bit of a connection with talking about power. And in some of this speculative work that I've been producing recently, I've been noticing this strange alignment between the ways that education technology is promoted in terms of personalization and scale, and the way that power is often talked about in terms of bodies, individual bodies, and populations. And hopefully some of that language is familiar to those of you who are interested in sociological questions of power. And of course also the idea of clusters working across bodies and populations. And that's the issues of power that I will go on to explain in more detail in the second part of the talk. So let me begin with a bit of promotional material around technology in education at the moment. This is an article from the New York Times, an example of current boosting of the revolutionary potential of large language models for education. And significant for me here was the ways that, and this is an article promoting Khan-Migo, which is Sal Khan, his latest additional piece of technology that works with the Khan Academy, which you might be familiar with, is a platform for educational resources, suggesting the biggest positive transformation that education has ever seen, and specifically doing this by giving every student on the planet an artificially intelligent but amazing personal tutor. And again, the same sentiment echoed by the CEO of Google. We can give every child in the world and every person in the world, regardless of where they are and where they're from, access to the most powerful AI tutor. This is a typical example of the kind of promotion we're seeing around large language models, generative AI in education, and significant to me because they reflect very similar claims about the old kind of AI, the kind of AI that I was researching a year or two ago that didn't involve large language models, but involved the collection of trace data, the production, often by private companies, of products that promise to personalize or adapt learning through AI. Software that could predict and intervene in our behavior by analyzing this kind of data. And we're looking here at the slide, at Derek Lee, who's CEO of a Shanghai-based company called Squirrel AI, who I've done a bit of work with and a bit of work on. And this is a sort of typical example of the way that kind of AI was promoted. And a super-powered AI teacher that is a combination of Einstein and Socrates. So the student feels like they have more than 100 teachers in front of them. The very similar kinds of promises of, I would argue, personalization and scale. And if you would permit me to go back even further, and I'm glad my book on MOOCs was mentioned in the introduction. Go back further in this chronology that I'm suggesting of education technology innovations to MOOCs, massive open online courses. I wonder if anybody remembers those. This is Anant Agarwal, former CEO of edX. edX was the company put together by MIT and Harvard, subsequently sold. And this is one of their promotional videos where he suggests online learning is the ultimate democratizer. And through MOOCs you can learn the best courses from the best schools and the best professors. Isn't this, I would argue, the very same kind of claims of personalization and scale? Personalization, admittedly, a little bit less sophisticated. Personalization here was just in the form of controlling your own access to video lectures. And of course, we all remember the notions of scale that were at the foundation of the MOOC promise. Perhaps this visualization from Coursera best embodies the idea of elite institutions from the US and Europe broadcasting video lectures to and awaiting populations elsewhere. And just to indulge my look back to the past even further, doesn't this collection of media hyperbole, these are headlines from around the year 2012, 2013, don't they look eerily familiar, I would suggest, to the kinds of excitement that we're now seeing that is being reported about large language models and generative AI for education? Revolutions, disruptions, the end of the university as we know it. So, of course, the idea of recurring promises in education technology is nothing new. This is a still you might recognize from the Hollywood film Groundhog Day, that some of you might remember, in which the main character relives the same day over and over to hilarious effect. And the first quote we're seeing there is from Mays back in 1995, who uses that very analogy of Groundhog Day to talk about the field of education technology, characterized by cyclical failure to learn from the past. We have technology today. Confidently, we expect to see the widespread effects of its implementation, yet curiously, it never comes. And 20 years later, Martin Oliver, Martin Weller, commenting on the very same historical amnesia, the year zero mentality of education technology, and Martin Oliver suggesting a sense of churn and a feeling of constant reinvention. That's the predicament, I would argue, that we're in this field of education technology that I work in. And of course, it's we're here again with generative AI. New promises. One way I would suggest of engaging with this historical amnesia, this year zero mentality, is to look to the past and education technologies from the past. And this book, this quote is from Audrey Waters, is an excellent recent example. Teaching Machines, The History of Personalized Learning. And she suggests here education psychologists like Sidney Pressey, person often credited with inventing the first teaching machine, talked about using mechanical devices back in the 1920s in ways almost identical to those who push for personalized learning today. The image is actually of B.F. Skinner's well-known teaching machine. So as a bit of an aside, I want to suggest there's a real need for this kind of research. For the field of education technology is kind of obsessed with futures, utopic futures, driven by engineering, but it rarely looks back. And importantly, there's a need for work that, as Waters describes here, isn't just about machines, it's about people, politics, systems, markets, cultures. It's a story of how the science of teaching and learning, as well as our imagination about teaching and learning, come to be caught up in mechanization, in efficiency. So it's not just about the history, it's not just about the technical features of the technology, to connect those to ideas and ideals about what we think education is and what it should be. However, I want to suggest a little bit of a different take on history for the rest of this talk, a different way of engaging with the past through a consideration of the history of power. As Isin and Ruppert suggest here, the ways in which the accumulation of subject peoples engenders accumulation of knowledge and enables accumulation of capital. So let me elaborate on that for a little bit. So drawing broadly on the work of Foucault in this regard, but also many others that have taken up and developed that work subsequently, Isin and Ruppert offer this, what I think is a very useful table that lays out a kind of history of different kinds of power, detailed in terms of origins, strategies, technologies, knowledges, objects, assemblages, and resistances. Hope the text there isn't too small for you to read. I could spend an awful long time sort of deconstructing this table, which is really a simplification of substantial areas of theory. So I have to be a bit careful of time. But perhaps just to pick out a few elements of this to emphasize what I want to talk about. I suppose the most well-known application of this kind of theory in education is a concern for a shift from the first kind of power to the second one, from a sovereign power to a disciplinary power. And some of this might be familiar to you if you're engaged at all with the work of Foucault or those who've built on that work. So in education, that typically involves discussion of the school as a disciplinary institution, here termed an assemblage of various actors, where the object of power and the focus of power is on bodies. Often in education, this is literally interpreted as the bodies of students, submitted to strategies of submission through schooling and conditioned by the technologies of confinement, correction, and punishment. And of course, in education, there's often an interest and a focus on power, I should say, knowledge, which features centrally in this kind of work. And just to elaborate on where I think this table is useful, of course, strategies and technologies produce particular kinds of knowledge. Submission, confinement, correction, punishment give us ideas about the kinds of knowledge that education produces, perhaps psychology most prominently. And of course also the assemblage of the school works to produce particular kinds of learning subjects in the body as the bodies of students, and of course knowledge about them. So there's ways that this table can be interpreted in terms of relationships horizontally. Knowledge, of course, serving to justify these other practices of power, justifying the ways that schools are assembled, bodies are disciplined, technologies are actioned, and so on. As Stephen Ball points out, education studies has often been focused on the negative aspects of power, as suggested in these quotes here, to which he underscores that for Foucault, power had positive and negative dimensions, and I'll come back to this point a little bit later. And of course, in the background, we're seeing the kind of image that is often interpreted as the grim, disciplining architecture and design of schooling. So let's speed on a little bit. Perhaps a little bit less well known is a form of power that shifts its object from the bodies, perhaps simply in education, the bodies of students, to populations of students, which Isin and Ruppert define here as regulatory power. And education studies have been interested in this form of power, particularly with respect to statistical knowledge. So the idea of understanding education through stable, predetermined categories, class, race, gender, and using these categories to seek to calibrate and adjust the outcomes of student populations. So there's an aspect of positive power here, as Isin and Ruppert would want to, I think, emphasize, the calibration of populations towards what they suggest as health and wealth of the population. And typical sort of research agenda here might be, how do we intervene to improve the outcome of women amongst a particular population, or this specific ethnic minority? This is the kind of power they're talking about as regulatory power in education. Hopefully some of that sounds relatively familiar. What Isin and Ruppert are really, the focus of this paper is to propose what they suggest is a fourth type of emergent power, sensory power. And it's this form that I want to suggest is highly relevant for thinking about the impact of AI, and particularly the impact of AI, of course, on education. And essentially it's a shift not from the object of power being bodies in classrooms or populations of students, but rather clusters, algorithmically derived, AI-derived, AI-generated clusters. And I'll go on to define sensory power in a little bit more detail. But before that, I just wanted to highlight another important part of their framework, which I think is very productive, which I think extends the way that people use these ideas of power, is to see these forms of power as not necessarily chronological or sequential, but embedded in each other, enmeshed. And this is the crude diagram I've tried to put together to convey this. And I've picked out some sort of key phrases where I think Isin and Ruppert are getting to this point. It's just a new form of power isn't replacing existing forms, but articulating with and in them. Thus a new form of power is to be found nestled in existing forms, but nonetheless mobilizing new strategies and technologies. And they talk about overlaps and dynamics between forms of power in terms of how they function, each depending on certain aspects of the other, a simultaneous existence of power, and how the development and articulation of a new form of power has increased their complexity. So this is how I'm interpreting what they're suggesting as a framework here, importantly, that any addition of a new form of power rearticulates, it's not just situated within, but rearticulates previous and established forms of power. And I'll go on, hopefully, to get to giving you an example of what I'm talking about there. So that's the sort of framework that I'm speculatively working with at the moment. Now, the claim that AI and associated technologies are introducing new forms of governance and power in education is certainly not a new claim. And there's a substantial area of research that is exploring this in detail, I would argue, around data-driven governance, algorithmic governance of education through data-driven platforms, through AI, and so on. And Ben Williamson, my former colleague up at Edinburgh, I think is a key writer in this regard. However, I think it's not often explicit in talking about power. It is so perhaps in talking about governance. But I think there's an importance in returning to this phrase and idea about power, or indeed sensory power, as I've described it briefly, specifically. So that's the connection I want to really sort of emphasize in this talk. And in doing so, suggest the need for some high-level zooming out, not just on the detail of how these technologies work, but on a wider view, of power. And as I just suggested, a connection between governance and older forms of power, older established forms of power, as I've suggested in the previous slide. So let me try to give you some examples of doing that by analyzing some examples of education technology. So I want to start with some examples of the old kind of AI. This is personalizing adaptive learning platforms. Here's some examples. Century Tech is a UK-based company. Alex is a long-established company in the US. Squirrel AI, I've already mentioned, is a company based in China who offer personalizing or adaptive learning platforms, products that schools or individuals can buy for a kind of education market. And personalization is, of course, providing resources or assessments to students ostensibly tailored to individuals. And based on their performance, that tailoring is done, as I'll go on to show in a moment, based on their performance, as well as an analysis of a wider population of performance, past models of how students are using these systems. And the key selling point, of course, is I want to come back to this key term of personalization. And these are examples of some of the promotional material around Century Tech. The idea that technology is shifting education towards a progressive agenda, serving and empowering the individual. And this, of course, may be the outcome, but I think as critical scholars, we need to think a bit more critically, lift the hood on some of these technologies, try to understand what's going on underneath, technically as well as socially. And this is some of the work I've been doing previously on personalizing technology. And I've suggested here some stages through which software like this works. A process of granularization to render topic knowledge down into points or nuggets or nodes, diagnosing individual students through an initial assessment to know which knowledge points are known and unknown, situating students within what is often termed a knowledge space and orienting them towards supposedly topic knowledge that is unknown. And so situating and directing, and here is where the algorithmic decision making, the personalization comes in, predicting an optimal pathway through that knowledge space. And there's some very useful visualizations provided by Alex that kind of explain this in a very easy way. This is what they term a knowledge space or a knowledge domain within the platform. These may be nodes or nuggets of knowledge within a particular topic, maths, geography, whatever it might be. Combinations of these are deemed to be important for understanding the topic, and sort of mathematically generated sort of structure of relationships is put together to define an optimal path in order to get to knowing everything within a particular topic area. And this is the broad knowledge space as Alex defines, and this is, as far as my understanding, is how most of these software platforms operate. This is the totality of knowledge within a particular topic area. And here we have a visualization of individual students supposedly moving through a personalized pathway through those knowledge points. But what I want to suggest is, rather than thinking of these as we're encouraged to do in this promotional video, as individual students, what we're actually looking here are clustering. Individual students are being invited to associate themselves with clusters of information about where individuals should be within this knowledge space. Individuals are attached to these calculated points on a map. This is very similar, I would argue, to the way that Isin and Ruppert described an object of power as clustering. They suggest live governing of the dynamic relation between bodies and populations through the enactment of clusters. And of course, what renders each of these points is not only individual conduct, data gathered from what an individual is doing within the platform, but that is calculated alongside the models that have previously been generated from everybody else using the platform. That's how the optimal pathway is derived. This is further how Isin and Ruppert define clusters: relational, multiple and fluid, visible and live. So relational meaning that students are related, as I'm doing here to interpret it through education. Students are related to past students, not to a class, not to a group that they're sharing their education with, but to previous conduct, and related to their ongoing performance. Clusters are multiple and fluid. They're not classifications in advance, as we saw with the regulatory power, pre-given classifications of gender, race, or class. They're derived from performance. We don't begin with these classifications. They're derived from conduct. As Isin and Ruppert suggest here, aggregate patterns and connections. Clusters are dynamic objects of governance. And of course, This is governance. This is deciding on an educational conduct and pathway. And clusters are made visible. They're made visible through data visualizations, which we'll look at in the next slide. This is how we see clustering. It's rendered into something that is made visible to us. This is one example of that rendering, but typically we see something like this. And this is, apologies for that moving quite quickly, but these are different aspects of a data dashboard, which is often a particular part of this kind of AI platform. And clusters are live objects, as Isin and Ruppert suggests here, involving measurement, identification, action and intervention that can happen live and recursively. There are decisions being made here at every step. Every time a student gets something wrong, gets something right, passes on a question, decisions are being made about that pathway in the moment. So back to my original rationale here around personalization and scale. What I'm suggesting here is that the object of power, the cluster that's determined through these kinds of platforms, is operating across these scales. As Isin and Ruppert suggest here, sensory power involves modulating the performance of bodies and populations through governing interventions that rely on technologies and machine learning, algorithms, and visualizations of clusters as relations. And what clusters do is mobilize governing interventions. So working across personalization as a mode of individualizing education, and scale, this spreading out to wider populations. So aside from just trying to convince you that clustering is a form of power that is enacted through these kind of platforms, it's also important, I think, to return, as I suggested previously, to previous forms of power. And this is my little plug for my book. Ask your libraries to order it on AI education in China. I don't really deal with power in the way I'm talking about today in this book. But I do want to draw on some of that work to talk about how other modes of power are re-articulated where this clustering happens. And this is an example of and I'm choosing China because China is just a very pronounced example of this kind of regulation. A few years ago, China issued a number of prominent policies for promoting AI in education. This is just an example of one called the Action Plan for Artificial Intelligence Innovation in Colleges and Universities, suggesting this 3-step plan to, by 2030, Chinese universities becoming global leaders in AI and innovation. And what was often talked about, and I discuss a little bit in the book, is the idea that that China were developing a talent pipeline for AI. So this is about teaching the skills of AI, the technical skills of AI, through the life course of education. And a big deal was made about some private companies collaborating on the publication of textbooks for very young children to learn AI skills, through to textbooks aimed at high school, through to a whole new suite of degree courses, university courses for AI, and AI linked in interdisciplinary ways to other subjects, to university research labs. And a great deal was made about this. And of course, not just from China, accusations of a talent pipeline were coming from the US. And this is a report I talk a little bit about in the book from the Center for Security and Emerging Technology in Washington, who arguably bolster this idea that there's a pipeline for AI talent in China, suggesting China has benefited from its centralized, systematic approach to implementing AI education at all levels and is well equipped to develop a robust, medium-term AI workforce pipeline. And when we look at some of the media promotion that went together with that report, we see a very definite idea that many in the education community in the US would have rather liked their own AI pipeline to rival supposedly what was happening in China to produce this new kind of talent. So what I'm suggesting here by drawing on this, of course, is that clustering as a power is not being produced in isolation. It's also re-articulating the way that education is regulated. Education systems here, arguably through these kinds of discourses, policies, media briefings, are being calibrated, recalibrated, adjusted here towards the assumed economic benefits of an AI-driven society. And of course, this is also conveyed in numerous reports around the time that talked about national AI capacity. This is a AI readiness report, one of many reports that were doing similar things from a company called Oxford Insights, I should say, not connected to the university. But is this not an attempt ranking countries in terms of their readiness to adopt AI? Is that not the attempt, I would suggest, to kind of classify, in the terms that Isin and Ruppert use, the health and wealth of nations? Here, through the sort of talismanic technology of AI, bolstering their ranking and their ability to benefit from this technology. What then of disciplinary power, the first kind of power that I talked about? How is clustering, re-articulating, re-establishing that kind of power? These are two images from some of the work that I did with Squirrel AI. This is the company based in Shanghai. The first is a rather staged image, promotional image from a private learning center where young Chinese people would go to mostly cram for exams. And we can see here what looks like a relatively vibrant educational setup with a teacher at the front, various technologies and laptops, presumably running the personalized AI software in front of every student. What we're looking at on the bottom right of the slide is another promotional image, not a staged one, but one that was promoting the use of the very same technology, the very same personalizing AI software in a state school. In a relatively underprivileged setting. So in the right, hopefully you get my interpretation, a rather stark version of the disciplining of bodies. There's no teacher present, at least in these the images that we're looking at. A stark version of the disciplining of bodies, a one-to-one relationship with the screen. Is this not the power of confinement, correction, that we know from disciplinary power, being re-articulated in the era of AI, where presumably this technology is being deployed to meet a deficit in teaching? And importantly, I would also suggest an illustration of how clustering sits within these other forms of power. The disciplining of bodies, as we can see here, but also the regulation of populations. Because the very reason that this software is used in this school is because statistically this school has been calculated as a site where intervention is needed. So precisely the clustering of AI that's happening, as we're seeing on screen here, is happening between this statistical power of deciding who is worthy of an educational intervention and the disciplinary power of traditional schooling, the power over bodies. So, some of you might be thinking, why haven't I talked about generative AI yet, or large language models? Well, I'm going to do that now. But hopefully what I've said so far, I will make it clear how that's relevant. This is a still from the TEDx talk in which Sal Khan, as I mentioned previously, launched KhanMigo, which is his attempt at developing a large language model chatbot for use with the Khan Academy platform. And of course, the key question here then is, how does this kind of AI, this ostensibly different kind of AI, generative AI, communicative AI, large language models, relate to the kinds of power that I've been outlining? Well, there's an intriguing phrase in the video where Sal Khan says, KhanMigo, which is this bit, this is the interface chatting with the bot here, knows all the context of what the student is doing. And what happens if you watch the video is this background bit is a particular question, so an educational a resource within the platform that is operationalizing the kind of personalization that I mentioned previously. And what a student can do is click on the button somewhere around here that opens up the chatbot through which the student can converse with the large language model about this problem. So the question is really how those two things are relating. And I'm not sure. And of course, there's been lots of hyperbole, if you like, about the use of that kind of generative AI in education. Some examples from prestigious publications here. I just picked out that quote from the Forbes article. It's astonishing that most professors, administrators, and even donors don't see the proverbial train barreling down the tracks. Perhaps like how climate deniers cannot calculate storms, rainfall, floods, droughts, and unbearable summers. So an interesting suggestion of this sort of inevitability of this transformation through technology, revolution through technology that we are unable to stop. So there's two ways we can go here in asking about this relationship between forms of power and this ostensibly new kind of AI. And first is this question: does generative AI, our dialogic communication with a large language model, suggest a distinct form of power? I'm not really convinced by that question, and I certainly wouldn't want to use this forum to suggest a new form of power. That would be a bit grand even for me. But I do think there are some interesting things to think about in terms of the power that we might see emerging with this kind of technology. And reflection might be a useful term here, given, as I mentioned previously, Foucault's interest in terms that allude to both a positive and a negative side to power. So reflection here, the capacity to promote reflection on the part of a student, thinking about the conversation they're having, but as well as the process of reflecting text back to students. And I should say here, emphasize already written and dominant texts back in the reflective process. And that links to the second point and the second thing that I think one would need to think about if one were sketching out some ideas about power here, where the source material of large language models comes from. And as many have pointed out, source material of a dominant culture. What are the texts that are not being scraped and brought into large language models? How are marginalized voices included and represented in the responses that are given back? if we wanted to go down this route, another thing we might want to think about is a kind of dialogic power. Meaning making and understanding only happens on one side of the relationship between a student and a large language model, arguably. The model in a way is static. Although surely our behavior is being used to optimize the AI functionality, and that's a point I'm going to come back to in a minute. But the development, if we are talking about interfacing with a large language model in terms of a dialogue, really only the human side of that relationship is developing through that relationship, at least in terms of the language. Bringing this back to the language of Isin and Ruppert, in the language of how we talk about power in sociological terms, what would be the strategy here, the strategy of power? A kind of responsiveness, being compelled to prompt and respond. That's something we should think about if these kinds of systems become standard in education. What does it mean to be required to ask questions, required to engage in dialogue, required to answer in that dialogic mode? That is potentially a kind of strategy of power. What is the knowledge being produced by these systems? Maybe linguistic patterns. Maybe that's the kind of knowledge that we take forward from this technology. What is the object of power? The interlocutor, maybe. That's the focus. And what about resistance? How would we resist? I know I haven't talked about resistance very much in that table. How do we resist this kind of power? Silence? Do we refuse to engage in dialogue? So I'm a little bit unconvinced that to pursue that as a new form of power. So I want really to end with a bit of speculation. What we're looking at here is an example of a image from another promotional video by Sal Khan, where he's demonstrating the new OpenAI ChatGPT working with his platform, and he's talking here with his son, who, if you watch the video, goes through a particular exercise in mathematics and is engaged in a dialogue with the large language model to progress through learning about the various angles on this right angle triangle. And my colleague writes interestingly about this video in his blog, terming this a kind of oblongification of education. That this is an image potentially of a future kind of classroom. The oblong being here, the focus of attention, the student and the tutor engaging in a kind of three-way dialogue. Obviously the teacher is an important figure here in that relationship, guiding that dialogue. But I want to just finish, because I know I'm probably getting toward the end of the time, with a bit more speculation, and just to draw attention to Sal Khan's new book, which I'm currently reading, Brave New Words. And what I think that exemplifies, at least in the domain of education, is a bit of a sleight of hand that's happening around these large language models and these kinds of technologies, is that we're focusing on the words. Focusing on the power of AI to reassemble words convincingly, and forgetting, again, coming back to the very beginning of my talk, and my suggestion of a historical amnesia in our field, a year zero mentality that we're suddenly having to start thinking of something new. This complicated reassembling of words. And forgetting about the investment in and the power of the old kind of AI that I've spent most of this time talking about, sensory power, a governance through clustering. And this is a bit like the trap of social media that we all fell into some time ago, when we thought social media was about connecting us. And then we found out it was about collecting our data. So I would be astonished if that's not happening with large language models. Maybe education are, as usual, behind the curve on this, but I haven't seen anyone really researching substantively the user data that is being collected behind our dialogic exchanges with large language models. And I would be astonished if some of these private companies are not doing that. I think in education we're still dazzled by the words. So here, coming back to Isin and Ruppert, here are some questions that I would suggest to think about the re-emergence or the re-articulation of that kind of power. And that's an important question. How is sensory power, in the ways I've briefly outlined it, being extended into our actions with generative AI? An extension of clustering. Is our dialogic activity being rendered as behavioral data? What clusters might be produced in the ways I've described them? Clusters that are relational, multiple, fluid, and live. What clusters might be produced by our dialogues with AI? Forms of governance that work across our behavior and our use of language. Those are the critical questions I think we should be asking about the technology. But of course that requires us to understand some of these proprietary systems. I'll just end by coming back to these two images, which I think are quite striking as potential visions of future classrooms. So not just thinking about clustering, but as I've suggested, thinking about older forms of power, how bodies begin to be power aligns bodies in particular ways, perhaps around the oblong, as Ben Williams suggests, the teacher and the student focused on the oblong, the interface of the large language model, or students lined up in less privileged settings to engage in dialogue with these systems. Should we return to these older, more established forms of power to understand the broad impact of these technologies? And of course, that needs empirical work rather than just the theoretical work that I've drawn your attention to this evening. So I think that's where I will end it, because I know I'm very close to the end of time. Thank you very much for listening.